This is Books for Breakfast, a podcast where we talk about books and writing. I'm Enda Wiley.
And I'm Peter Sirr.
And you're all very welcome to this morning's show. On today's show, we'll have journalist and broadcaster Olivia Leary, who'll be in to rise to the Toaster Challenge.
And Enda will be talking about poet and novelist Helen Dunmore.
And what about a legendary dinner? That sounds interesting. More from Peter about that later. So, the coffee's made.
The toast is on.
And the books are on the table.
And you've brought in a book by a writer you've loved over the years. And indeed, it's a writer who I know very well as a poet. But she's not only a poet.
Yeah, that's right, actually. I mean, this is a writer who I've loved for very many years. I've brought in a book by the English poet. She's also a novelist. She was a children's author, and her name is Helen Dunmore. She's also the author of this book that I've brought in, which was actually her last novel. It's called Birdcage Walk. And I really think that this is one of Helen Dunmore's finest novels. I don't think you can say that it came out of nowhere. She was a very prolific writer, and its brilliance, I think, is honed from years of really spectacular writing. She was the author of 12 novels, 3 books of short stories, numerous books for young adults and children, and 11 collections of poetry. So amazing writer, really. If you like, I'll just tell you a little bit about her. Her first novel, Xena in Darkness, was, I think, really quite a remarkable debut. I remember reading it and being really, impressed by it. And John le Carré described it as beautiful but inspiring. And if there is one word I'd use about Helen Dunmore's writing, I would say it is beautiful. Not in any kind of trite way. I really mean in a deep, profound way. One of the critics said about her that she couldn't write a bad sentence if she tried. But her first novel, Xena in Darkness, explored the events which led to D.H. Lawrence, the writer, being thrown out from Cornwall, being expelled from it because the locals suspected he was a spy. It's a really interesting story, and it won the McKettrick Prize at the time. And about Helen Dunmore, it's fair to say she was no stranger to prizes. Her third novel, A Spell in Winter, won the first ever Orange Prize for fiction. That was way back in 1996. And she went on to become a Sunday Times bestseller. And I think Anthony Beevor at the time described The Siege, another novel she wrote, as a world-class novel. So you're really talking about a superb writer. And I loved her novel Exposure. It was a brilliant spy thriller set in London in the 1960s. You might remember that book hanging around the house, Peter. I couldn't stop reading it. And also another great novel, The Greatcoat, which was published in 2012. Hammer asked writers to write a series of kind of ghost stories, and this was a really fantastic ghost story. That's another area that I love as well, and it's set in the aftermath of the Second World War.
Indeed, yeah, I remember The Greatcoat. Fantastic ghost story, but...
Yeah, do you remember a coat is found in the cupboard, and I don't want to give it away, but it's quite extraordinary, and it really, really kind of scared me. It's definitely a book to read late at night.
I'm just wondering, why do you like the writing so much? I mean, is it because she's a poet? Is there a connection with that?
Yeah, I think at a very deep level, I love her writing because obviously I write poetry myself, and I connected with the way she writes. Her prose, as I said earlier, is always charged by a kind of rare sensibility and an intelligence. She doesn't show off, and she has a huge empathy for all of her characters. I feel she's a really deeply humane writer. Also, I have to say, I did have a brief connection with her. I was a young MFA student in Lancaster in the early 1990s, and I saw an ad for a poetry workshop that was being run by a poet I had never encountered called Helen Dunmore, and also another poet, Philip Gross. And so I went along with another emerging novelist at the time, Andrew Miller, and we were really struck by her. I mean, I think she was very inspirational. She was really generous in her guidance to us as young writers that weekend. And I know she trained as a teacher, and this was really apparent in her. And in fact, throughout her life, she was renowned for encouraging emerging writers. So from that moment on, I began to read her work in the early 1990s, and I have to say, I was completely hooked.
Yeah, indeed. I remember Andrew Miller, who went on to become a very distinguished novelist. And I remember inviting Helen Dunmore to Dublin many years ago and being very impressed by her. And of course, she died quite recently.
Yeah, I mean, that is the very sad thing. I mean, it's always sad when a really fine writer leaves this earth. And sadly, Helen Dunmore died in 2017. She was only 64 of cancer. To kind of get back to the book in a way, she lived in Clifton Wood in Bristol, which was the setting of this last book that I've brought in, The Birdcage Walk. And in her obituary in The Guardian, they said that She knew she was dying only at the editing stage of this book, but she suggested in an afterword that she must have known subliminally because the novel was full of a sharper light, rather as a landscape becomes brilliantly distinct in the last sunlight before a storm. So you can hear there, even in the way she's describing the book, there is a wonderful lyricism to it. So it's the story of an 18th century, it's set in the 18th century in Bristol, the land, the city that she knows so well. And so when I was reading this novel, I couldn't help but think of Helen Dunmore because I'd read that she had a flat in Bristol that she used to like to go to, and she used to write there high up over the city. And she'd said in the interview, I found the view beautiful and absorbing, but not a distraction. And certainly from what she produced in this flat, this last book, she was certainly not distracted because it's such a fine book. But just to say as well, in connection with her last novel, her final poetry collection, Inside the Wave, was published in 2017 as well. It was published shortly before her death, and posthumously it won the Poetry Award and the overall Book of the Year award in the 2017 Costa Book Awards. So what I really feel about Helen Dunmore is we're so lucky that her books are still with us. It's so tragic and sad that she's gone, but she's such an incredibly accessible, heartfelt writer. And also, I would like to say as well, I know you want to say something, Peter, but I also want to say she always, I felt, had an amazing ability to take the past and make it incredibly present for the readers.
Well, speaking, I mean, we get back to the poetry later, maybe, but just to get back to the Birdcage Walk and indeed the past. I mean, it's a novel set in the 18th century, but it's a novel about the French Revolution as well, amongst other things, isn't it? I mean, or that's the period.
Yeah, well, it's kind of like it's set in 1792 in Bristol. The French Revolution is going on. It's not entirely about the French Revolution. We enter the world of this character called John Diner Tredevant, an 18th century property developer, and he's building a magnificent terrace in Clifton, high up above the Avon Gorge in Bristol. And he's got a wife. She's a second wife. She's a young woman, and her name is Lizzie. And throughout the book, we're kind of wondering about the details of his first wife, what happened to her. But as readers, Helen Dunmore is quite clever. We have been witness at the beginning to an eerie description of a man rowing from Bristol to a kind of a glade where he's left his dead wife and he's trying to bury her fast where no one will find her. So from the very start, Birdcage Walk has a kind of a thriller feel to it, and it just kept me turning the pages.
It sounds like too that like there's seems to be an impressive array of very vivid characters in it.
Oh yeah, completely. And as you said, it is the time of the French Revolution, and this is going to have a catastrophic effect on John Diner's property speculations. Of course, this would be catastrophic for most business people, but John Diner, you see, is a really dark character, and Helen Dunmore is brilliant at drawing this kind of oppressive, jealous character out. And there is kind of like nearly in a Heathcliff way, there is an undercurrent of violence to him, which, as I said, is just really well depicted by Dunmore. And this works as a great comparison with his young wife, Lizzie. And her life kind of balances and depends on her husband's moods. So if he's in a good mood, Lizzie is. She learns how to kind of humour him, to keep the household functioning. And Helen Dunmore is always brilliant, I think, on small domestic details. So you really get a sense of the house they're living in. But, you kind of feel sorry for Lizzie as well because she knows that her husband has a secret and she's trying to find out what it has. And also she's unusual because she's been reared in a house very different to the one she lives with her husband. Lizzie's mother, Julia Fawkes, was a renowned late 18th century radical and a writer, and her wisdom is really carefully and subtly depicted by Helen Dunmore. And then she's got a stepfather, Augustus, who's also an academic, and he's kind of a charming mix of a brilliant man and also a kindly man. So really there are very vivid characters there. But Lizzie, she does suffer. I think she suffers throughout the novel. And of course, as the novel progresses, John Diner's money situation becomes worse and worse and worse. And we feel like we're on the edge of a disaster. So there's a very ominous kind of feeling going throughout this book, which, as I said, makes it really, quite honestly, a page turner.
And I mean, obviously, you're saying like John Diner is a man with a past and a man of secrets. What about his first wife?
Yeah, I know exactly. What about his first wife? So what makes this book so engaging is the constant wonder we have about the first wife. What really happened to her? And in this way, it kind of reminded me in a way of Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca. There are really memorable scenes. Like there's one where Lizzie goes to the dressmaker, where kind of eerily a dress is there which has not been collected by her husband's first wife. And Helen Dunmore describes the dress as a silvery waterfall of Spitalfields silk. So you can hear even there the way she describes things. But this dress makes Lizzie curious because it's such a beautiful dress. And she says, I'll never understand why she didn't come to fetch her dress. So she's thinking this and we're thinking this. So it makes for a really brilliant novel.
I mean, she's drawn, as we've seen, she's drawn constantly to the past. Is she good at evoking the period in this one?
Oh, I think it's so vivid. I mean, you spoke about the French Revolution. She's a very brave writer and she isn't prepared to step back and kind of sanitize history in any way. And so when she's describing, for instance, people being killed by the guillotine in France, she doesn't retreat from that horror. She actually says it as it is. And it's also interesting to me as well, I think, that Birdcage Walk is actually a path. It actually exists in Bristol and it leads from the graveyard of a Clifton church. And this is actually where the fictional Julia lies buried with the inscription, her words remain our inheritance. And I really think that in this novel, Birdcage Walk, Helen Dunmore's words, her beautiful words, remain our inheritance as readers. And I feel this is a novel that will definitely last.
That was Enda talking about Birdcage Walk by Helen Dunmore. And can you remind us who published that, Enda?
Birdcage Walk is published by Hutchinson.
Before we finish up, Enda, you wanted to say something about Helen Dunmore's last collection of poems.
Yes, I did, because I said, as we said earlier, I really feel that Helen Dunmore was always first and foremost a true poet. Way back in 2007, her poem The Malarkey, which she submitted actually anonymously, won the National Poetry Competition. And at the time, she said it was about what time takes away and how we take time for granted. And I feel that that quote really relates to her last book, the wonderful Inside the Wave, published just before her death. It's heartbreaking, really, because it bridges life and death. And it's also a bit like Birdcage Walk, remarkably brave and honest. 48 striking poems. There's also 5 versions from Catullus, a Roman poet I know you love very much, Peter. And the title poem, Inside the Wave, is directly connected with Homer's Odyssey and Odysseus' return home from his travels. There's a beautiful poem called My Daughter is Penelope. And as I said, she posthumously won the Costa Poetry Award for this. And even though it's written in the face of death, I feel it's profoundly life-affirming. The last poem in the collection, Hold Out Your Arms, is addressed to death. And death is depicted by Helen Dunmore as a mother. I found this poem really, really moving. It was written just 10 days before her death, and it was added to the collection for the second impression of the book, published in June 2017. And if you like, Peter, I'll just end by reading the opening lines of this poem. Would you like to hear them?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So it goes like this. Death, hold out your arms for me. Embrace me. Give me your motherly caress. Through all this suffering, you have not forgotten me.
Thank you, and that was good to talk about a fine and much missed writer. So Enda was talking about Birdcage Walk by Helen Dunmore, published by Hutchinson. Inside the Wave by Helen Dunmore, published by Blood Axe Books. I should also say that there's also a selection or a collected poems that Blood Axe published called Counting Backwards, which has all her work in it. And of course, Inside the Wave was the one that Enda was talking, that was again published by Blood Axe. And as usual, details of all these books can be found on booksforbreakfast.buzzsprout.com.
Well, it's a huge honour to welcome today's Toaster Challenge guest. She's one of Ireland's best known broadcasters and journalists. Olivia O'Leary, you're very welcome to Books for Breakfast.
Thank you, Enda.
It's great to have you here. Well, Olivia, you can sit back there for just a few minutes because I'm going to praise you to the hilt, okay?
Oh, no.
So Olivia joined RT as a news reporter in 1972 and she was Belfast correspondent from 1975 to 76. She began writing for the Irish Times newspaper in 1978 and she reported from Argentina on the Falklands War. And in 1980, Olivia O'Leary became a presenter on RTE's flagship current affairs programme, Today Tonight. She left to work on BBC's Newsnight and was made that programme's first senior female presenter in 1985. 1985. She later returned to Today Tonight, and she also presented Questions and Answers and Primetime on RTE. Olivia has won 3 Jacobs Awards during her broadcasting career with RTE. She's also won a Sony Award for her BBC Radio 4 programme Between Ourselves. She has co-authored the book Mary Robinson, the authorised biography with Dr. Helen Burke. And in 2004, she wrote Politicians and Other Animals, a sketch on Irish politics. In 2011, as if that wasn't enough, Olivia, she was awarded an honorary doctorate by her alma mater, UCD. And in 2017, Trinity College awarded her an honorary doctorate. Originally from Borris, County Carlow, Olivia does a radio column every Tuesday for the Drive Time programme. And of this, Rosita Boland in the Irish Times has said her weekly Drive Time radio diaries are one of the best things on air, always wearing their erudition lightly. So it's really hard to know where to stop about Olivia. She's a woman of many talents and interests. She's also a dedicated member of a choir. I think it's called the Culwick Choral Society, is it, Olivia?
Yes, it is.
And she also plays the piano. And speaking of music, I read, I think it was in the Irish Examiner, that Olivia, you love Colm McInerney's album, The River Holds Its Breath. And Peter and I were delighted to read this because Colm kindly gave us a gift of one of his tunes, Thou Shalt Not Carry, from his album The Hare's Corner for our podcast signature music. So delighted that you like Colm McInerney's music too. But just to start with a brief chat before we begin the Toaster Challenge, we're both wondering, we both know you, Peter and I, as many poets do, as a really great presenter of the poetry programme on RT Radio 1. But we were thinking, growing up inland on the shores of the River Barrow, which is a really beautiful part of the country, did it inspire you, Olivia, to have an interest in poetry? And from that, has it become a lifelong interest? I was just wondering.
Well, the interest in poetry, it may have come from that. I think it was more really from growing up with music. And, you know, to me, poetry is music in words. But I love the Barrow. I'm looking down on the Green Valley here because I'm living in Graignamanagh at the moment. And it was for us, it's a sort of a linear national park. It was where we played, it was where we partied, where we learned to swim. So we all swim as river swimmers, you know, none of your beautiful American crawls or anything like that, but sort of doggy paddles. And it's been to me, when I think of beauty and I think of home, this is where I think of green and quiet and peaceful and endlessly interesting. Different birds, different river animals, you know, the otter, you'll find them early in the morning or late at night, owls overhead. Just a very beautiful countryside and lovely because I feel it belongs to me, or rather I belong to it.
Yeah, that nearly sounds like a poem itself, Olivia. It's so beautiful the way you're describing it. We're sitting here in the city. We wish we were there. But was there a love for poetry in your family home when you were growing up?
There was more, I suppose, a love for music and for songs.
Yeah.
And with me then, I think I began to play with words, and I began to realise that poets, more than anybody else, value words and care about words and defend words and protect words. I don't think any other literary art cares as much about the use of the word and the precision of the word as poets do. And that's when I began really, really to admire them, because with very little recognition, they were the great protectors of the word.
Mm-hmm. The great protectors. That's a great way of putting it. Olivia, you and I and Peter share a great love for a place in Kerry called Carradaniel, Derrynane. And speaking of a love of words, I remember last summer the Waterville poet Paddy Bush and I had the privilege of reading poems to an audience in Derrynane House in the chapel there. And there was a jingle singer, an amazing Shannon singer, Muireann Nic Owley, and she sang a song by the Eve Raw poet of Daniel O'Connell's time, Tomás Rua Sullivan, who's also buried on the Abbey Island just off the beach in Derrynane. And I know that you like that particular poem. Yeah. And could you tell me a little bit about why you like it? It seems to combine all the beautiful qualities you were just talking about there.
Because in a way, that song was the beginning of my growing up, the beginning of my separation from my parents and the acceptance from my parents of particular values. So I would have come from a household that wasn't particularly big on Irish, and that was partly a political thing. We weren't Fianna Fáil, let's put it that way. And I went to the Gaeltacht in Kerry and loved the countryside, had never been to Kerry before I was 14. But what really caught me was when they taught us some songs, and one of the songs that they taught us was that wonderful song Our on a Leabhar. And it would have been the lovely minor key really that appealed to me first, and then the words. And when I came home, I was playing it on the piano. 14 years old, you're into sad things and minor keys, and my mother asking me what's that song, and me telling her and being really enthusiastic about it, and realising that separate from my parents, I had found a door into the Irish language and Irish culture which they hadn't found and they didn't know about. So that song was precious to me, because in a way it was the first time I opened a door into adulthood and said, I love this, I don't care whether you do or not, and I'm going to find out about it, and what's more, I'm going to tell you about it. So I think that's why I love that song in particular. But also listening, RTE, thank goodness, every so often rerun programmes, and Sean O'Riga, they did a wonderful series about the Irish song, the Irish traditional song. And in it he explained the difference between Munster and West of Ireland, Connemara songs in terms of the two different traditions. And the one thing he said about Munster, he said, a little bit like the Munster landscape, you'll find that the songs from that part of the country have great big leaps, big intervals, octaves, sixths, sevenths. And the opening of that song, Our on a Leabhar, is a lovely one. It goes da, good fifth,
Oh, it's beautiful.
And Cannon has written a wonderful poem about that song and about that opening deep move from a G down to a C, for instance, a so down to a do. And she understood that as well, that sort of architectural makeup of a Munster song.
Yeah, she's a master song. It's also a wonderfully tragic story as well, isn't it? About the head schoolmaster. He's moving from Derrynane to Portmagee, isn't that right? And then his beautiful collection of manuscripts lost in a storm at sea. I loved the story of it as well.
The story was wonderful. The story was wonderful, but it was the actual music that caught my eye, because Paddy Bush, inevitably, Paddy's always subversive,
Yeah.
And Paddy does raise the question as to whether there was an element of bathos in this lament. After all, could anybody really feel that terribly sad just about books? And yes, perhaps they could. But he did also warn us that we might all have been taken in.
Okay. Well, Olivia, thanks for that. And speaking of Derrynane, I don't think we can mention it without mentioning the really brilliant two-part TV series, The Forgotten King of Ireland, made by yourself and director Alan Gilson and Forty. And Daniel O'Connell is a man you've called a hero, a big man with big ideas. So just really briefly, I suppose you can't say it briefly, but even if you could just tell us a little bit about what it is about his achievements that you so admire.
It was the breadth of mind and the realisation for a man that was born in the 18th century that human rights applies to everybody, of every colour, of every background and every gender. And it was when I looked into it and I realised that he had read all the great liberal thinking books of the 18th century, and he had very early on, after reading Mary Wollstonecraft, he had said, the mind has no gender. And it was big in his life because his politics, and he said this, his politics were based not on might, on military might and strength, but on persuasion, and that women could do that as easily as men. So it all dovetailed, the non-violent politics, the acceptance and recognition that human rights applied to everybody of every race and every gender. There was a terrific consistency about his thought. And it's unusual enough to come across a politician who reads deeply, and he had read deeply, and he was consistent in his standing out against slavery, and he was absolutely vicious to those that he felt had benefited from it, and refused to go to America for that reason. People think O'Connell went to America and was fated there. He never went, and refused to go because he felt that the American Constitution was a lie, because it left out so many of the people who lived in that country.
Yeah, an amazing man. Well, that was a really great documentary as well. It was great to bring him back to the fore again.
Thank you.
Yeah, so thanks for that, Olivia. Well, Olivia, I can see Peter getting the bread ready there. So I'd love to spend more time chatting with you about so many things, music, poetry, Derry Nan. The list goes on and on. But I think it's time for the Toaster Challenge. And Olivia, you've about 2.5 minutes to talk about a book that has really touched you. And so I think, are we ready to go, Peter? The bread is going into the toaster. We're really looking forward to hearing your choice. And so 1, 2, 3, the bread is down and off you go.
Well, the book that I'm recommending is called Kate O'Brien, A Writing Life, and it's her biography by Eva Walsh at the Irish Academic Press. And the reason I recommend it is that it is so well written. It's an absolute joy to read. And there's no hint of the overly academic, because the great thing is that Eva, as well as being an academic, is, of course, a writer, a novelist. And that I think there's no greater compliment to a writer than that her biography should be beautifully written. And it's important for loads of reasons, but he recognised the importance of Kate O'Brien as the most important chronicler of the Irish provincial middle class. And, you know, there's always been a bit of a national myth here that there was no middle class, Catholic middle class, until independence. But of course, despite oppression and the penal laws, there was. And Kate made no secret of the fact that she was setting out to prove that very point to an English reading public, particularly a British audience. And you see, I'm just old enough to have been part of that world of you know, good silverware and mahogany furniture, including a prie-dieu for private prayer. And OK, the furniture was a bit heavy and overwrought and old-fashioned, as Kate's prose can sometimes be. But we were part of a Roman Catholic empire. And there was travel to the centre, Rome, and to Lourdes, even in the 20s and the 30s. And there were aunts who were nuns and visits to the parlour with wonderful high teas, and there were uncles who were priests, and they did all the family weddings and births and funerals. And there was intense talk at dinner about religious rules and about Catholic philosophy, and everything was Catholic. I mean, I would also have been there when the whole question about the Vatican II Council was being discussed at the dinner table. But everything we did was Catholic. There were Catholic authors, there were Catholic composers. Mozart, of course, was at the top. There were film stars who were Catholic, like Bing Crosby. And her young female protagonists, all of them, they love church and they love family, but yet they need to be free. And that tension is at the centre of all the books. But the new light that Eva threw on Kate, for my generation, I'm now 70, is the bigger insight into her lesbianism and her introduction into, you know, what seemed like traditional novels, her introduction of taboo subjects like gay love, like adultery, like syphilis, like suicide. And the mix of Catholic guilt and scrupulosity and boarding school convent life and glorious liturgy with sexual sin and death. I mean, that was an erotic, exotic mix, and it still is. This is a great book.
That's great, Olivia. Thanks very much. And that came in exactly on time.
I'm glad the old professional counting still works, Peter. Yeah.
But it's great, though, to be reminded of the groundbreaking achievement of Kate O'Brien. I mean, probably one of the finest of Irish writers. Indeed, I remember Eileen Battersby saying of the Land of Spices that she thought it was one of the finest Irish novels yet written. And I'm fascinated what you say. I mean, that whole kind of Catholic middle-class culture that had never been written about before, all that snobbery and repression that she writes about so well. And I just wonder sometimes, I mean, that Ireland kind of has vanished in a way. I mean, we're not without snobbery and repression still, but it's a different kind, perhaps. And I just wonder, now that Ireland has vanished, does her work continue to speak to us? Is she still read? Do you have a sense of people still engaging with her work?
I get the impression that younger people find her prose and her obsessions, with things Catholic and with sin. They probably find that hard to grasp. I wonder whether people of my generation may be the last to fully get Kate O'Brien, but it's the chronicling of a particular way of life, a particular awareness and sense of sin. I think the sense of sin in the novels is wonderful. And I don't know if anybody has that anymore outside a certain generation. I mean, good old Eileen Battersby, the wonderful thing about her was that she always recognised quality, no matter where it came from. And she never let the reader down. So she did. She was a great champion of Kate O'Brien. I know that I've lent Kate O'Brien novels to English friends and they didn't get it at all. And yet in the 50s, she was an enormously popular novelist in Britain. I mean, she's mentioned, as you know, in Brief Encounters. The lady in Brief Encounters is on her way to the library to borrow the latest Kate O'Brien book. So I think we will always probably be reading her now with a slight sense that this is an Ireland that's gone. So we'll be reading it as much for the history as anything else.
Thank you very much again, Olivia, for coming in and talking to us on the Toaster Challenge today. And you were speaking about Kate O'Brien, A Writing Life, and that's a biography written by Eivor Walsh and published by the Irish Academic Press. And as usual, all details about the books discussed will be available on our website, www.booksforbreakfast.buzzsprout.com. So thanks once again, Olivia O'Leary.
Thank you.
So, Peter, a book about a famous dinner, or rather a famous lunch and dinner. I'm not quite sure if that's allowed on Books for Breakfast. But anyway, I'm looking forward to hearing about this book, about this famous gathering that you've brought in. I can see it there on the breakfast table. So would you like to tell us a bit about it?
Yeah, so this book is called The Immortal Evening, and it's a legendary dinner with Keats, Wordsworth and Lamb, and it's by the American poet Stanley Plumney. So it's a book about a very famous, well, it became a kind of lunch and dinner that took place on the 28th of December in 1817. It was a dinner hosted by the then very famous painter Benjamin Robert Haydon at his house in London. That he had moved into it recently because he had been in very cramped quarters, and he was a painter of these enormous pictures, and so he had to get a bigger place for his studio, and so he decided to bring all these poets together. I mean, it's kind of funny because he has all these people. I mean, Keats, for instance, who was just 21 at the time, but who only had another 4 years to live. William Wordsworth was there. And then he was obviously like a well-known, very established poet. And then Charles Lamb, who became the famous essayist that some of us had to study in school. And there were a couple of other people as well, including a man called Kingston, who had the grand title of the controller of stamps. And that was a bit that was a bit awkward because Wordsworth had a job in the post office, and so your man was technically his superior and kind of reminded him of that during the dinner. So it was slightly awkward.
Yeah, I mean, what a gathering, though! What a gathering! I mean, Charles Lamb, he wasn't quite famous yet, and they all were. I mean, was there any particular reason for this occasion?
Yeah, there were a few reasons. I mean, Haydn is a fascinating character. I'll talk a bit more about him later. But I mean, he had the dinner for, I suppose, or the occasion for two main reasons. He wanted to introduce the young and emerging Keats to Wordsworth. Obviously, Wordsworth is the big shot at that point.
Yeah, great romantic poet of the time.
Yeah, and he had met Keats before, but there was a very frosty encounter where he responded to a poem that Keats had written, and he kind of made some pretty disparaging remark about it. So it wasn't a very brilliant start. So anyway, that was one reason he wanted that. You know, obviously Wordsworth is the big romantic poet of the time, and the second reason was he wanted to share his progress on what was his most important historical painting to that point. I mean, that's what he was. He painted these enormous kind of history paintings.
Yeah.
And the one that he was working on at the moment, he was 3 years into it at this stage, and it's Christ's entry into Jerusalem, which is an absolutely massive work.
Yeah.
And what's interesting though is that it incorporated the faces of Keats, Wordsworth, and Lamb. So they're all there anachronistically, kind of in Jerusalem as Christ enters it. And it's a painting. I mean, it actually still exists, and it's in a museum in America now. So he wanted to, I suppose, he wanted also to show off his new studio,
Yeah.
which is also the dining room. So they're there eating their meal right in front of this enormous picture, which
Oh my
which
God.
has them in it.
I mean, is it fair to say, Peter, that people nowadays may not have heard of Haydn the painter? So who was Benjamin Robert Haydn?
Well, I mean, he's in a way the chief character of this book. He was a very famous painter, or he was trying to become. I mean, it was hard work becoming a famous painter, but he was pretty well known, but he depended on patronage, and he lived totally from hand to mouth. And sometimes people bought his paintings, or some. I think the King of England bought one of his paintings. But he spent his life in and out of debtors' prison. He was always in debt. He was always on the run from creditors, and his life, in fact, had a pretty tragic end. He committed suicide in the end. It all got too much for him. But at this point in his life, he's pretty well known, quite famous, he's for these kind of historical paintings, and he goes on lecture tours around England and Scotland and so on. So he's kind of as well known as he can be.
Yeah.
But I mean, one of the things that's interesting about all this is because you realize how much is at stake always, how much it takes to survive as an artist they're in Regency kind of London, and they're all on their uppers in a way. I mean, obviously Keats, having abandoned medicine, he but doesn't have a job. Wordsworth, that Keats kind of slightly despises the fact that Wordsworth has taken a job in the post office and sold his soul, if you like, but Wordsworth, famous and all as he is, has hardly any way of living. So he has to, and Lamb, for instance, who's there as well, works all his life for the East India Company, 9 to 6 every day, 6 days a week. And he does all his writing on the job, in fact. So kind of money and fame and all that is very much part of that, the nature of, if you like, creativity.
Which is so interesting. And listen, the book begins by describing various walks that they're taking.
Yeah,
Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, yeah, because they all had to come from different places, and I like the way. I mean, Plumley has kind of imagined their various journeys. Obviously, Keats coming from Hampstead, Lamb coming from Covent Garden, and Wordsworth coming from Cavendish Square in the newer sort of Georgian part of the city. And like Lamb is the city man, and for him, the city is nature. The crowds, the very dirt and mud, he says, the sun shining upon houses and pavements, the print shops, the old bookstalls, coffee houses, streams of soups from kitchens, the pantomimes, London itself a pantomime and a masquerade, all these things work themselves into my mind and feed me without power of satiating me. So that's Lamb. And then Wordsworth, of course, is the countryman. No great love of the city, but of course he's also the poet of Upon Westminster Bridge. Earth hath not anything to show more fair. Dull would he be of soul who could pass by a sight so touching in its majesty, and all that. And according to Hazlitt, Wordsworth walked 180,000 miles in his life, so he won't notice this particular
Exactly. A short walk to the house. It's quite a long book. Looking at it there, it looks quite long. Is it all about that one day and evening?
Yeah, it's funny because part of the reason I bought it was because it's such an to me attractive idea that here's a book about a dinner. I mean, or okay, lunch and dinner. How can he sustain it? And where's all the information going to come from? And of course, yes, he does describe the dinner, the meal in depth, largely through looking at the diaries of Haydn and others who were there. But he uses it also as a way of talking about the kind of what happened before and after it, to look at the whole kind of network of friendship among these poets and writers, the nature of kind of the Romantic movement in England, so it's very much not just that. It's also, of course, the life of Haydn as well. So from this point onwards, and there's all kinds of stuff in it. I mean, there's people who weren't there, of course, like Hazlitt, who was the leading art and literary critic of his day, or Coleridge, who was the great friend, companion of the Wordsworths. And, So we get all kinds of other stuff that's there, like Hazlitt's own disastrous dinner for the baptism of his son, for instance. He invites everyone to come, forgets to find a parson, and then he's out looking for him when the guests arrive, and then there's no food, and finally a dish of potatoes, cold, waxy, and yellow, as Haydn remembers it, are brought out. So it's 1817. It's that day, 3 days after Christmas, but it's the whole rest of their lives. It does go back and forward in time. I mean, but there are some brilliant things in it.
Yeah, tell us some of the things you thought were brilliant. I mean, really what I'm hearing as well is this idea of the dinner and the supper. It's really a hook to kind of hang a portrait, an actual portrait of the romantic poets, but also to hang the portrait of the web of their friendship. That was such a crucial part of everything, wasn't it?
It is. And in fact, as a good example of that, I mean, he goes back in time to Lamb meeting William and Dorothy Wordsworth in 1797 in Somerset, which was a rare excursion out of London for Lamb. And he meets his old school pal, Coleridge. At that point, Wordsworth is 27, Coleridge is 25, Lamb is 22,
So they're quite so young, really.
Yeah, and you realize, I mean, that whole network of friendship. And Wordsworth and Coleridge are good friends at that point, and they have kind of merged into what Plumley calls a single signature and singular imagination. And of course, one result of this is the lyrical ballads, which come out the following year. So friendship is one of the big themes. And he reminds us that, friendship for all four of these friends is life. But at this particular point, Wordsworth unusually is the two of them are living in comparative luxury in this country mansion. And so they're in this kind of splendid pile when Sarah Coleridge, and this is an amazing story, I think, Sarah Coleridge accidentally spills a skillet of boiling milk on her husband's foot. And so he can't go out walking with them. So what does he do? And I think this is actually my favorite part of the book. He stays at home and he writes one of the most amazing poems in the language, one of the so-called conversation poems, This Lime Tree Bower, My Prison.
So Peter, we need a skillet of boiling milk if we're going to write brilliant poems, isn't that it?
This is it. Let me just give you a little bit of that. I mean, yeah, absolutely, we do.
It would be lovely to hear it. This lime tree.
No, I'm not going to read it. No, but it's just that thing of, because again, it's a poem very much about friendship and particularly about his friendship with Charles Lamb. This lime tree bower, my prison. Well, they are gone, and here must I remain. This lime tree bower, my prison. I have lost beauties and feelings such as would have been most sweet to my remembrance, and so on. And then he talks about Charles, my gentle-hearted Charles. Thou hast pined and hungered after nature many a year in the great city pent with sad yet patient soul. And we realise later that Lamb has been going through the total mill at this point. He was very close to his sister, and his sister had a breakdown, as part of which she stabbed their mother to death. And then so Lamb had to find her a kind of private asylum in which he could put her to keep her out of the reach of the law. And so she kind of spent a lot of her life kind of in and out of madness. And of course, he had to take care of her. And it's one of the reasons as well that he had to spend his whole life working in the East India Company.
So there literally is a feast of stories in this book about them all. I mean, that's an incredible story about his older sister stabbing his mother to death. I mean, as the book develops, does it become more about Haydn himself and his various travails?
Yeah, it does. And so we see the ups and downs. I mean, it's very interesting as a portrait of Regency London, because it's all happening there, and you have massive contrast between the life of the very wealthy and descriptions of fabulous meals, and whereas the meals that the artists would have had are pretty simple affairs: a bit of wine, a bit of an old chop, or maybe some roast beef and a few spuds. But we get all these lavish descriptions of meals in the palace and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, no, Haydn, there's descriptions of his time in the prison and getting in and out of that. And eventually, he gets to the age of 60 and he goes out and he buys a pair of pistols, and he comes back and he shoots himself, and that doesn't even manage to do the job. And so he's staggering around his room, cutting his own throat after several attempts, and that becomes the end of him. But there's an interesting kind of aftermath in that he wrote a note to the Prime Minister, Robert Peel, and he asked Peel to look after his family, which he did. Peel set up a committee and they awarded a generous pension to his family. So in fact, so he in effect died to preserve the life of his family. So it's a very sad
Yeah.
story. And it is, I mean, what's sad also, I mean, obviously all these characters are so, well known now and famous, and we read them still, but nobody goes and looks at Haydn. I mean, he was a great catalyst. The other thing he did was he introduced Keats to the Elgin marbles, for instance, and that had a huge impact. They had just been recently stolen, in effect, by Lord Elgin and were in his back garden, while the likes of Byron and others were protesting against this kind of cultural theft. But Keats saw these and was totally stunned by them, and it influenced great poems like Ode on a Grecian Urn or A Sonnet he wrote directly after seeing them. Yeah, it's full of that kind of those kind of stories,
And also, I suppose it's the kind of book that will bring you back again to Wordsworth's writing, Coleridge's writing, Lamb's writing, and certainly I'm going to be looking up Benjamin Robert Haydn. What an amazing dinner to have had on the 28th of December 1817, The Immortal Evening by Stanley Plumley. I mean, you said like more to say, Peter. You're so excited about this book.
No, I mean, and also just Google the picture. Have a look at the picture. I mean, as well, the famous kind of, and you'll see the pictures. You can make out Lamb and Wordsworth and Keats in that picture. So just have a Google of that,
and maybe we should hang it up in our own kitchen wall and invite friends round for dinner and superimpose their faces on it.
Yeah.
That might be another idea. That was Peter talking about Stanley Plumley's very interesting book, The Immortal Evening. It's published by Norton and Company. I think we've reached the end of our Books for Breakfast podcast this morning. I'm definitely rushing off to have more coffee. And I'm Enda Wiley and Peter Sirr here with me. And Peter, would you like to tell everyone about the details of the podcast if they'd like to listen again?
Well, you can subscribe at all the usual sources, Google and Apple and so on. And if you want to check out the notes that go along with this podcast, you can go to booksforbreakfast.buzzsprout.com. And yeah, so
we'll be back again next Thursday morning. We'll have the toast on, we'll have the kettle boiling, we will have more books to discuss, and we're looking forward to having you here. So goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye.